Go ahead.
Give you guys a little bit of background about General Haynes. He served in the Second World War at Iwo Jima, which I believe he'll spend much of his time tonight sharing with us. He also served in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. He rose in the ranks from a junior enlisted man to a 2-star general, which he retired as. He played a significant role in U.S.-Turkish relations, and after his retirement, he became an executive in the aerospace industry. After that, he went on to be a consultant for CBS, a military consultant, where he met his wife, Bonnie Haynes, who's up here in the front, who's joining us this evening. Beyond that, General Haynes has earned and been awarded many awards. And I'd like to share a few of those with you. He earned the Cross of Gallantry in Vietnam. He was awarded twice the Presidential Unit Citation. He also won the Bronze Star, and he is one of only 6 generals in U.S. military history to command 2 divisions. Before he died, he's a man with a lot of history who has given much of his life to our country. I think tonight will really be eye-opening and hopefully incredible for all of us. I want to explain some of the format tonight. The general will begin tonight sharing with us for about 15 minutes. And then after that, we'll move into an interview format where Professor Preston Jones will be interviewing General Haynes. And during that time, be thinking of questions. And we'll wrap up tonight between 8 and 8:15 with questions from the audience. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to General Haynes.
Thank you very much. I have to tell you honestly, I'm very much honored to be here tonight and to pay a visit for the first time to JVU. My impression is that you guys are really lucky. You have a super president, and you've got an #1 history boss here in Preston Jones, and your money raiser sitting in front of me here, Jim Crawl, couldn't be better. And I am here because of a very close friend, Leighton Stroud. He and I started out many, many years ago, 65 or so, in the Boy Scout movement. I was born in Texas as he was, and I was raised there. We happened both to have gone to Southern Methodist, and from SMU, I went on to a military career. What I'm going to do tonight is spend about 15 minutes running through my career and how it fitted into the history of the world, which is really what Preston, I think, would like to have us concentrate on here tonight. He has several slides that he will show you at an appropriate time, which will point out the areas that we're talking about. Anyway, you will be hearing from Leighton's wife, by the way, in about 2 weeks. Mrs. Stroud is one of the great musicians of this country. She is a violinist, and she'll be talking to you about music. She owns one of the most valuable violins in the entire world. That doesn't have anything to do with war, but she met Leighton in the course of a USO tour that took her to Okinawa toward the end of World War II, and Leighton happened to be a medical technician with the Navy there, and she figured out what she was going to do. He didn't know this, but she was working on it, and later they met up in Texas and finally got married. So you're going to be lucky to hear from her, and I'm very fortunate to have been a friend of Leighton, and I've heard so much about John Brown that I really am indeed honored to be here. I think it's a great place. I think you're all lucky. I don't know if you know how lucky you are. You will after you graduate. So go after it. Well, my education, I've mentioned SMU. I got a bachelor's degree in biology from SMU. Then I went into the military. This was in February of 1942, and went on active duty. Later on, I got a master's degree from the George Washington University, a master's in political science, and went to a number of military service schools, but the highest one was the U.S. Air War College. Now as to highlights during my career, already we've mentioned Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was the bloodiest of all Marine battles throughout history. And just to put it in perspective, we have lost about 2,000, maybe 30 of our own military killed in Iraq in a period in excess now of 2 years. At Iwo Jima, in a period of 36 days, we lost 6,000 killed and 19,000 wounded. It's the one battle of the Pacific War in which we lost more than the enemy did. The Japanese lost 22,000 at Iwo Jima. Most of them were killed, whereas we had 6,000 killed and 19,000 wounded. After the Second World War was over, just a few years as a matter of fact, Korea came along, and Korea was really the first active battle, the first combat that we had at the beginning of the Cold War, into which most of you were born. The Cold War has been over now, 7 or 8 or 10 years, depending on how you gauge it. But I was in Korea as a second in command, as a major, second in command of a battalion of the 1st Marines. I'll just backtrack to Iwo for a minute and tell you that I was a captain in the unit that seized Mount Suribachi. And all of you, I suspect, have seen the famous photograph of the flag raising at Iwo on top of Suribachi and the famous statue in Washington, D.C. After Korea, I had a series of appointments, but the most important one was in Turkey before I went to Vietnam. I was naval attaché to our embassy in Turkey, in Ankara, Turkey, from 1958 to 1961, and happened to be there at the time of the overthrow of the Turkish government under Adnan Menderes. The Turkish military pulled a coup d'etat and deposed him. And we can talk about that one later. After that, I had a tour with I guess we'll just say Mr. McNamara's office in the Pentagon. I was the director of Near East and South Asian affairs, so that was really my second introduction to the Middle East, and I have ended up over time spending a great deal of time in that area. I was promoted to Brigadier General in 1968 and headed up the legislative side of the Marine Corps with the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Following that, I was promoted to Major General, 2 stars, which was my final rank. I commanded the 2nd Division, which at that time had responsibilities for the Atlantic, for the Caribbean, and for the Mediterranean. In between that division command and the command of the 3rd Division, I had a very interesting job as the senior member of the Military Armistice Commission, the United Nations Military Armistice Commission, in Korea at Panmunjom. And then, following that, I took command of the 3rd Division, which had at that time responsibility for parts of Vietnam, the Western Pacific, and the Philippine Islands, and that general area of Southeast Asia. Following the division command, I went to Washington again and headed a board which finally took my name, the Haynes Board, which designed the Corps for its missions post-Vietnam. And that particular board had a considerable effect on the organization and the functioning and the missions of the Corps, which culminated in the first Persian Gulf War, and to some degree has affected the current war in Iraq. My final tour on active duty was as Deputy Chief of Staff for Research and Development of the Marine Corps, after which I retired, and as been indicated earlier, I was an executive in aerospace and was the chairman for almost 10 years of the American-Turkish Council, again, which we can chat about a little bit later. I have also been chairman of the combat veterans of Iwo Jima for a good many years. I have been able to do all of this simply because I managed to live this long. I'm 84 years old. I heard 2 ladies behind me when I was coming in today, and I should set the record straight, I guess. One of them said to the other, "Wow, what do you think he uses on his hair?" And the other one said, "Well, it looks like Avon number 17, light brown." I don't dye my hair. I'd like that a matter of record, mister. With that, and that is a sort of a framework into which we can fit our questions and so forth. Since this, as we've indicated earlier, this really is being done for the purpose of your archives here at John Brown, as well as being a kind of an introduction to somebody who has lived through a tremendous amount of American history for the past, now closing on 70 years, so far away.
All right, well, first thing that comes to my mind is, first question is, what percentage of officers in maybe in the military in general or in the Marine Corps who retire from the service get to the rank of 2-star?
Well, the question is how many or what percentage of officers become 2-star generals. There is a law here in the U.S. that you must retire after 35 years of active service and 5 years in grade as a permanent major general. So the exact numbers I can't give you, but it's a very, very small percentage. If you take the lineal list of all the officers in the Corps, the number of people who get to general officer rank is just about that much. I mean, it's just really very few pages. When I retired, there were a total of 65 officers of general officer rank, brigadiers, major generals, lieutenant generals, and full generals. The Marine Corps has, because of its high quality of people who come into it and who make a career of it, now the chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff is a Marine 4-star general by the name of Pace. That's the first time in history. We have, we have four stars who are in command of various area commands or various military expeditionary units in Iraq, in the Western Pacific, in the South that cover Latin America and so forth. But to go back to the point, very few, maybe.
So what that leads me then to is, so what did you have that the others didn't have that got you to that point? What does it take?
Well, my hair didn't turn gray. No, number one, I was lucky. I survived the Iwo Jima, which, as I've indicated, was the bloodiest of any battle the Marine Corps has ever been in. And I survived Korea, I survived Vietnam, and I've simply been, as the Yankee batters, when they hit a home run, you see them point up here. I think there's something up there that's been looking out after me. I'm not guaranteed that, but it is that, plus the fact that I was, I believed in the Corps. I believed in what we were doing, and I think much of the early leadership that I may have displayed came from our association earlier, as I was talking to Layden Stroud about this evening, as such things as Boy Scouting. I was an Eagle Scout. I was the first chief of the Micanaqua Lodge over in Texas, and I really picked up a huge amount from my early years up say until I was 18 or 19 years old, and that paid off.
So a question I was going to ask later, but since it's sort of come up now, I'll ask now. What are, you think, just some basic elements that a leader needs to lead successfully?
Well, I think there are several important points. Number one, you have to have good health no matter what. You really, there's just no escaping that in the military. That has to be a given. The commitment that you make to the military is a commitment that you really make to the country. I think you have to have a strong belief in the ideals on which this great country of ours is based. I think you have to have a full understanding and practice of the essence of the Declaration of Independence, of the Constitution, the famous Bill of Rights. I think all of these things you have to have a thorough grasp of, and you have to believe in them. And you have to believe in yourself. You must have a sense of your own worth. That's not being cocky and not being smart aleck or whatnot, but really believing that you do have the capability to lead, and you always have to put your men, and nowadays your men and women, first. You cannot, if you intend to be a really good leader, it's the people under you that you have to pay attention to. It's not the people up above. And as I've always said, Professor Jones, you learn, at least in my case, I learned much more from my juniors through the years than I learned from my seniors.
That leads to another question I had then. As a junior infantry officer, you went into combat, and we have the famous picture from Iwo Jima behind you. We'll come back to that in a second. But then as a high-ranking officer, then I imagine you're involved at certain points during certain conflict in sending men into combat.
Yes.
And what the question I wanted to ask is, and maybe it's a question that doesn't make sense, but is it harder to be the guy who gets the order to go into combat, or is it harder to be the man or person who gives the order for other men to go into combat?
It's harder to be the one who gives the orders. It is a huge amount of responsibility to send young men into battle, and where they may either lose their lives or be severely wounded. And it goes back to perhaps an earlier point, and that is you have to consider, it becomes even second nature when you've gotten into a situation where you have lives at stake. Second nature to think about, what am I doing? What am I going to tell these people, whether it's a platoon of 40 men or whether it's a company of 225 or 30 or a battalion of 1,000 or a regiment of 3,000. What am I sending these guys into? And what can I do to make the job of carrying out these orders easier on them? We have a very complicated, or not complicated, but a very large inventory of weapons. We have artillery, we have rocket launchers, we have rifles, we have machine guns, we have mortars, and so on. And you have, and in making any decision to commit people to battle, commit people to, whether it's taking a hill like Mount Suribachi in back of me, or getting a cave that's full of, in World War II, Japanese enemy or what, you really think through, and you learn to do it quickly. You think through what has to be done to make it easy on the individuals that you're ordering to go and do X.
Can you tell us about, is there a particular memory you have of, you have an occasion where you need to get an operation done, but the decision was...
Well, I think one that comes to mind quickly, and is triggered by the photograph behind you, is that our combat team, which was Combat Team 28, was assigned the initial mission of cutting Iwo Jima in half, cutting the head off of it, which happened to be Mount Suribachi.
Can you just, I'm sorry, just for a little background, can you tell the students what the importance of Iwo Jima, what is Iwo Jima and what's its importance?
Iwo Jima was in, and is again today, was in the Japanese Tokyo Imperial Prefecture. It was homeland. And it was the first area, the first surface area that we went into, that we invaded in World War II. It was 600 miles to the southeast of Tokyo, and it was roughly 600 miles to the northwest of the Marianas Islands, which was Saipan, Tinian, and so forth. The B-29s had been brought to Tinian and Saipan as soon as those two islands were taken. And the Pacific Command was in the process of mounting a major bombing campaign against Japan. The problem initially was that the B-29s had to fly all the way, about 1,200 miles, from Saipan over Tokyo or Yokohama or Yokosuka or Kokura in Japan, drop their load of bombs and get back. Well, they had no fighter cover, and in those days the fighter aircraft had limited range, and the only solution that we could see was to take Iwo Jima and develop the airfields there. There were actually There was one finished by the Japanese and two others that were being finished. And to fly, when the B-29s would come from the Marianas, they would fly over Iwo Jima. The fighter aircraft would take off with them and lead them on these attacks and would ward off the attacking Zeros. And if a B-29 was damaged, it could limp back probably as far as Iwo Jima. In fact, by the end of the active hostilities in the Pacific, Professor Jones, the number of crewmen in the Army Air Corps who had been saved by being able to land at Iwo when they had been crippled or were running out of fuel had equaled the number of casualties we suffered in taking Iwo Jima. I mean, so there's some comfort in that. It was a very bloody battle, but it got fighter cover, which could give not only about 5 minutes of cover over Tokyo, because the fighter planes of that day and time, the P-51s, had limited ranges, and they would run out of fuel very quickly. So they simply went over with the B-29s, protected them for a few minutes, and then scooted back to Iwo. And the B-29s that were damaged or running low on fuel came back and landed.
So the purpose of taking the island was at the air base. So then to get back to when I interrupted you, you were telling us a story. I asked you about an event where you had to make a decision.
Yeah, well, we in Combat Team 28 had been assigned the left flank beach. It was called Green Beach. It was 500 yards wide, and the left side of it was almost under the vertical walls, the vertical sides of Suribachi. Suribachi was not a big mountain. It was in fact, the Japanese called it a pipe mountain because it looked like a pipe. It was a volcano and still is. And as an aside, the island has risen out of the sea about 35 feet since we attacked it 60 years ago. It is an active volcano. No, I mean, it's not a belching volcano, but it is active. The magma from the core of the earth is pushing it up out of the sea. But to go back to the question, we needed to get ashore as quickly as possible as much firepower as we could. We were to land at 9 o'clock in the morning. We were to land with about 3,500 troops over that beach, and were to cut the island in half quickly. So that meant going in under the guns of Suribachi. I mean, it was looking right at you. It's like those lights in the back of the room. And there were many caves in the mountain and many gun positions on it. And we had to simply put as much naval gunfire as we could against Suribachi to protect against fire from the caves. We had a very carefully worked out scheme where the naval gunfire would lift about every 5 minutes, and the troops would push up as nearly as they could to the exploding naval shells, but the shells kept the Japanese defenders down while our troops were moving in. Now, we had an argument with the Navy over the number of 37 millimeter guns. I don't want to get too much into the technicality of this, but the 37 millimeter gun in those days was a direct fire weapon which could be used against tanks or against caves or against pillboxes. And we specifically were given enough landing craft to carry only only 4 guns and 4 jeeps. Jeeps were the prime movers, the things that pulled the guns. And we had, I think, total of 8 craft we were given, 8 landing craft to land those guns. Well, we took the argument up actually took it up to Admiral Nimitz because we needed to get as much firepower in as we could, and Nimitz finally agreed that we could overload all of those landing craft with a jeep and a 37 millimeter gun in the same boat, which was an overload for the boat. So he and we were quite willing to take a risk that if we had very high seas, we might lose some of those because of swamping of the landing craft. Truth is that on D-Day, when we landed, we lost only one 37 millimeter gun and jeep en route to the beach, and that was hit by gunfire from Mount Suribachi. But it's this kind of thing. We doubled the amount of, essentially doubled the amount of firepower we got in the 3rd or 4th wave.
What did the beach look like when you arrived?
The beach was a mess. If you have seen what's the name of it? The Search for Private Ryan? Yeah, the Ryan movie is a good movie of the Normandy beach over in Europe, and the beach at Iwo was just about like it. I mean, it really was a nightmare, is the best way I can put it. The landing started at 9 o'clock, and the Japanese waited for about 30 minutes before they opened up on the beach, before they opened up with all of their weapons. And I landed about 9:30 or 9:45, and got up about 2 terraces, and then really had to hit the deck. The beach was very hard to climb through. It was coffee grain sand, and you'd go up to the top of your field boots. It was very difficult to maneuver through it or to climb through it. And then I remember I hit the deck with a fellow named Joe Bush, who was actually was one of the 37 millimeter gun commanders, and there was a machine gun up on the Mount Suribachi. I don't think it had our name on it, but it just kept peppering right in front of the 2 of us, and we agreed we had to dig deeper. We took our helmets off and started to dig in the sand, and the sand would simply pour in with every load that we lifted out. And we were just lucky. I was very lucky. I mean, people were being killed or badly wounded or blown apart on all sides.
Was that your first experience in combat?
It was the first time I was in combat, yes. I taught at the Marine Corps schools in Quantico. I taught tactics and weapons and so forth.
How did I always ask veterans, how did that first experience in combat change you? I mean, at the time you don't have time to think about it.
Well, the first thing I found out was that I don't shake up very easily. I didn't know that would happen. I mean, I wasn't sure what would happen to me when I had my first taste of combat. But I was busy. somehow, in my own case, and you find it in a lot of cases, there was more apprehension going into the beach than there was after I got there and after I got involved, because I was the operations officer, which means I had to coordinate the artillery and the naval gunfire and the air support, and had to make sure that orders were getting out to the battalion commanders and so forth. I just simply found out quickly that I could operate under duress, and that held true the rest of my life in the Corps. In Vietnam, my helicopter was hit 2 or 3 times, and it just, it didn't bother me. It should have, I guess. But it's just one of the things you find out about yourself in a hurry.
Sometimes, you hear from, like Theodore Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War said he was almost thrilled by battle. And you hear that a few times. You're not talking about that.
I was never thrilled by battle. I got to tell you, I go with our motto, nobody likes to fight, but somebody has to know how. There are some people who are thrilled by battle.
Did you know some?
Chesty Puller is one. He's now dead, but he was awarded 5 Navy Crosses in his period of service, which included World War II and Korea, and I think he got 1 Navy Cross much earlier in Haiti in one of our Banana War periods. But no, I don't pose as being a hero, nor was I delighted by getting into this sort of stuff. War is a pretty nasty, dirty thing. It's not romantic, I can tell you that right now. But it's like we say, if somebody's got to fight, somebody has to know how, and I happen to be one of those guys.
Do you remember the names of guys you went into Iwo Jima with who didn't make it out?
Oh yeah,
Can you tell us about 1 or 2?
Yes. My best friend in the Corps was a man named Wilkins, who was a graduate of Dartmouth. He commanded Company A, and he made it across the island in the initial assault in the first hour and a half of the battle. But after we took Mount Suribachi, we were assigned to attack and take a hill that was number 362A. It was the western anchor of the Japanese defense line on the north end of the island. This was a tiny island. I don't know how many of you know it. It was only, it was 8 square miles. That's pretty peanuts around here, It was about 2 miles wide at the widest point, and the narrow neck, which we took in an hour and a half on D-Day, was only 700 yards. That's 7 football fields in width. So it would, and Suribachi was at the very southern end. It was 554 feet high, and the base of Suribachi was maybe 750 to 780 meters. The size, if you stop and think about it, 22,000 Japanese defending a place that was only 8 square miles. And we finally had to put 70,000 Marines ashore there to finally clean it up. Can I interject something here that I think would be, this is a good point to do it. One of the burning issues right now is the question of how we handle detainees and prisoners in Iraq and in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and it's a real issue. And And I'm one of 25 admirals and generals who have put together a letter in support of Senator McCain, who is attempting to get a rider through Congress on the military authorization bill. The rider would really simply legislate common human decency. As Bonnie, my wife, frequently tells me, that's, you know, why the hell do we have to legislate that sort of thing? And it's too bad we do, but we do. But anyway, we're supporting McCain's position. And it isn't that we don't know how to handle prisoners. We do. And I'm going to give you a quick example, which is a fascinating story. On the 17th of March, which was 10 days before we finished off the last Japanese on Iwo Jima, just about dawn, a Japanese soldier, stark naked, his hands in the air, came out of a cave and presented himself to one of our remaining lieutenants. We didn't have many lieutenants left at that time, but this fellow was from Texas, a guy named Candy Johnson. Candy didn't know any Japanese, and the Japanese didn't know any English. All we had been taught was, okay, surrender and we'll feed you and take care of your wounds. And after having said that, that was the end of the conversation with any prisoner until we got a Japanese language officer to come and take over. Meanwhile, listen to this, meanwhile, while Johnson is looking at this guy who's trying to surrender to him, a bullet hits Johnson's helmet right dead center. And instead of killing him, which it could have, it was a Japanese sniper had picked him off. It hit his helmet, went through it, and scooted around inside the helmet and dropped out the back end. Now, if I had been Johnson, I might have killed that Japanese guy. I might have felt he set me up, you know. But instead, Johnson didn't panic. He called his company commander, who was a first lieutenant by the name of Fiorenzo Lepardo, and he asked Lepardo, remember, this is at dawn now, this is in battle, and we have very few key leaders left. Lepardo says, we're taking prisoners and I'll match up with you. So they matched up. And there were three of them looking at each other, not knowing how to speak each other's language. And out of the clear blue, this Japanese surrender, this fellow was surrendering, said in almost perfect French, "Parlez-vous français?" And it happened that, you know, do you speak French? And it happened that Lepardo was a graduate of Notre Dame, had taken 4 years of French. And so he says, oui. He gives him the yes. And thereupon ensues the point I'm trying to make, that we knew how to handle prisoners. Johnson would have been perfectly justified in shooting the prisoner, boom, like that. But he didn't, and Lepardo and this fellow struck up a conversation in French. It turned out that the Japanese was the code clerk, top secret code clerk, for the commander of all the Japanese forces on the island. And all this is in French now. He said, hey, look, you know, this goddamn war is no good. We're not going to win. You guys are going to win, and what can I do to help you? So he said, well, I got a few things you can do right now, which was to help clear the Japanese out of a number of caves, which were in a pocket that we were trying to clean up at the end of the battle. And that's what happened. And the Japanese in the caves who came out bonsaiing. They were intent on killing our folks. They were not about to surrender because they had been instructed by General Kuribayashi to kill 10 Americans before they were killed. That was the instruction to all the Japanese defenders. So Lepardo had some machine gunners handy, and they took care of these guys. But the Japanese prisoner helped clear out several caves, a half a dozen. And by this time, it was about, I'd say about 8:30 in the morning. And we got this prisoner back a couple of hundred yards back to our combat team command post. And one of the Japanese language officers we had started questioning him, and it turned out that he really did know a lot of things. He had been a top secret code clerk in Tokyo, and he had a great deal of information on the defenses at Okinawa, which was to be attacked on 1 April of 1945, only roughly a week or 2 weeks after this guy was captured. So, to make a long story short, the prisoner was given we put him in some dungarees that had come off of wounded or dead Marines, cleaned him up, sent him back to the senior headquarters on Iwo, and they immediately saw his value. They flew him back to Guam, put him on an airplane, flew him back to Guam quickly, and Admiral Nimitz headquarters flew him back to Washington as fast as they could. And he turned out to be one of the most valuable of any prisoner that we captured in the Pacific. Now, to put this in perspective, my combat team of 3,400 men, all but 600 of whom were either killed or wounded, captured only 16 Japanese. They wouldn't give up. They insisted, even if you caught them, they insisted that you kill them. Well, we didn't kill them, but there were only 16 of them that we captured, and they were wounded, except for this fellow who, incidentally, was a graduate of Tokyo Imperial University. He was a very bright fellow, and he gave Lepardo a photograph of himself, his wife, and his little girl. And we're now trying to find him. His name is Sakai. We've been looking for him for a long time. Japanese who didn't get killed in World War II were considered to be dishonored if they gave up. Now, if they were badly wounded, they were okay if they were made prisoners. But it was an iffy proposition for them. And when they got back to Japan proper, many of them just disappeared into the woodwork. And this is what has happened with Sakai. I sent a note to the American Embassy last week to see if there was any other way that we could search for this guy or for his daughter or for his wife. He would now be about 4 years older than I am, and he may be dead, who knows. But, and his daughter would probably be somewhere around 70 maybe.
Well, related to the question of how you treat prisoners, one question I had in mind is, you fought in the Pacific, and then in Korea, I know less about that, but I know in Vietnam, if an American soldier, or for Western soldiers, so for a British guy or an Australian or a Canadian American, if you're taken captive by the Japanese in the Pacific, or in Vietnam, you get captured, The Geneva Conventions are not going to be observed, and just for the audience to know, the Geneva Conventions are basically these rules that govern how prisoners should be treated. Prisoners should not be tortured. Prisoners should not be starved to death. They should be given a place to sleep, shelter, and so on. But you mentioned John McCain, for example. So he's a prisoner of war for many years and is tortured. And then it seems that a lot of the world doesn't care about the Geneva Conventions. And so the question is, why should the United States continue to observe the Geneva Conventions?
Because we believe in common human decency. That's basically it. If you read read the Bill of Rights in our Constitution, and read the first, second, and third Geneva Conventions, of which we're signatories, I don't care, we don't care, I don't know about you guys, but I don't care what anybody else thinks. You have to treat people decently. It is absolutely wrong for a couple of reasons to mistreat them and torture them. First of all, if you torture a guy, he's going to tell you anything. I mean, I know this from experience. And 99% of the people you capture are turnips, and you can't get blood out of a turnip. I've tried it, and it just doesn't work. And so what McCain is trying to do, and what those of us who are supporting him are trying to do, is simply go by now the third Geneva Convention. And why should we? Because we're Americans, because we believe in this. We believe in treating people decently. And furthermore, if you want to be tortured, if you torture and make it a practice of torturing, the next time they grab a hold of you, you may be the one tortured. I mean, there's a certain amount of simple selfish payoff to this also. Now, I never hated the Japanese, but I came very close on 2 occasions. On Iwo Jima, one of our lieutenants who was wounded was grabbed by Japanese and pulled into a cave. We didn't know where he had gone. We knew that he had disappeared. And the second one was a sergeant who disappeared. And we finally found both of them. And one of them had had cigarettes put out on his torso. He was dead, of course, when we found him. Were the cigarettes put out when he was still alive or not? We don't know. But the other one, whose name was Ignatowski, had every bone in each hand broken, had his arms broken, had his upper and lower leg bones broken. Was that done while he was conscious? I don't know. So for about 5 minutes, I hated the Japanese when I saw Sokol's body and was given a report on Ignatowski. But the fact that it happened to those guys didn't mean that we had to take Sergeant Sakai and put cigarette butts out on his chest. It's just that simple. You don't do it. And we're Americans, and we don't, or we shouldn't, do it. I can guarantee you don't get anything out of people whom you're torturing. They'll tell you anything, and it's usually not very important. And again, most of the guys who we have in detainees, like the 500 or so at Guantanamo Bay, they're the turnips I'm talking about. They're people that you're not going to get any blood out of anyway, even if they talked. I think we ought to send them all home. But
after I ask this question, let's go to the crowd and see if you have any questions. So think if you have one. And after this, did you ever wonder in whether it's World War II. Well, let's stick with Iwo Jima. Have you ever had the conversation with yourself, or just had the thought that's gone through your mind? You mentioned some names of guys you know who didn't come back. Are there other names that you can just list right now, fellas? Just give us the names of others.
Yeah, well, I can give you the name Ignatuski, Sokol, Hutchcroft, Wilkins I've given. And I'll simply tell you that two of our, that my boss, my colonel, was a bronze medalist in the 1920 Antwerp Olympics. He was that quality guy, and he was an All-American football player from the West Coast. In opposition to us was a Japanese by the name of Nishi, a lieutenant colonel who won a gold medal at the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles, and who won the individual equestrian event. Well, I tell you that to show you that, you know, we had some pretty high quality people around, and most of our people were. One of our guys became the president of the World Bank, for example.
Well, have you ever had the thought ever go through your mind, why did I make it?
Oh,
These guys?
that's an eternal question you ask yourself every time you get up in the morning. I mean, I do.
What's the answer you give?
The answer is, I've just been plain lucky. I mean, I don't think, have the conceit to think that somebody up there is looking specifically after me, or others of us who came through these various battles. Maybe he is, or she is, or it is, but I'm not at all sure about that. I am sure that I simply have been very lucky, and the real heroes of any war are the dead ones, and I just happen to be alive. I'm just lucky to be here, that's all. And I say daily, well, frequently now, when I think about the people that I had who lost their lives in the 3 wars I was in, I ask myself, what about me? And I conclude that I'm just very, very lucky. That's it. I mean, maybe I asked a corporal one day what he would like to see in a platoon leader, a lieutenant to command his platoon. He said, I want somebody, General, who is very, very lucky. There's a lot of truth to that. You'd like to have your boss, and my boss came through, even my boss, Harry Liversedge, came through Iwo Jima, Bougainville, Guadalcanal, never got scratched. I did too. I came through without a scratch. So, you know, it's not because I'm particularly of great value, although Bonnie might argue with me on that.
Is there a question? Anybody out there have a question?
Yeah.
Let's go to Kelly and then we'll come here.
Sir, tell us a little bit more about your time in Korea.
Oh yeah, in Korea, Korea was really the beginning of the Cold War.
What was the Cold War?
Well, the Cold War occurred when, following the end of World War II in Europe, and indeed in Japan, the communists, mainly the Russians, to some degree the Chinese, began to shift their emphasis to counter our power, in effect. And the evidence of that showed up on the battlefield. To answer one of your questions about Korea, we had very, very few troops in Korea when the North Koreans attacked the South. And the North Koreans were very near total victory. They had all of our forces pushed into a tiny bridgehead at Busan, Korea.
I have a map behind me.
Oh, heck, good. Okay.
Busan there.
the North Koreans made their way all the way down to here, and it was really just a fairly shallow bridgehead here. We the Marines, managed to scrape together a brigade and a half and got them into this area and held this against the North Korean army. MacArthur then was given command, and he took our 1st Marine Division, and one of his really brilliant moves, came all the way over here with that division, landed, cut the North Korean army off. We went on way up to the Yalu River, which you see here. This is the Incheon landing, and this is the Yalu. The Chinese then decided to enter the war, and a huge number of them, probably initially 150,000 or so, came across the Yalu River in this area, and you can see the arrows as to where they came. The Marines managed to get out, managed to fight their way out, and then to further answer your question on Korea, a kind of a stalemate settled in, and not much fighting other than trench warfare occurred. There was very little maneuver. We had beaten the Chinese. They were running out of beans and bullets by this time, and we could probably have gone back to the Yalu River again, but and that's what MacArthur wanted to do, and the famous meeting between him and President Truman occurred, in which Truman told him, forget it, we're going to stay on the 38th parallel, and that's it. Now, that was really the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War continued through Vietnam and ended really when Mr. Reagan pinned Mr. Gorbachev to the wall and said, hey, you got to take that wall down, the Berlin Wall, and Gorbachev himself started the disintegration of the Soviet Empire to the point where it is today. So,
How would you compare combat with the North Koreans and the Chinese to the combat against the Japanese?
the combat against the North Koreans and the Chinese was much easier than against the Japanese. The Japanese in World War II were enormously difficult, an enormously difficult enemy comparatively. I mean, after all, if your boss says you got to kill 10 Americans before you die, and then, you know, he himself is prepared to commit harakiri, which he did. Kurabashi stabbed himself with a knife and had his aide cut his head off with a sword. You know, that's pretty tough stuff. The North Koreans were tough, but beatable. And the Chinese, poor guys, in a way, I shouldn't say poor guys, but it was 15 degrees below zero up on the Yalu River. And the Chinese had these quilted uniforms. And I got to tell you, they don't keep you very warm at 15 below. And they knew we had warming tents. What we did was set up warming tents with kerosene stoves in them behind the lines and protected by hill masses, so that our guys could come off the line, quickly get warmed up, and then go back. And so the Chinese started surrendering. They'd come up and throw their weapons away and ask for help. And we took them in, we got them warm and so forth. But that's, they were, the Chinese, under those circumstances, they were pretty easy to fight. That's not to say they would be now, I don't know, but you know, they're probably better equipped. But I hope they're not going to be our enemy. There's too many of them.
Question here, Dan, did you have one?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The stereotype of World War II fighting versus the stereotype of Vietnam fighting are drastically different. What would your take be on how the wars were different, how they were different?
Well, of course, World War II was fought against, and as a matter of fact, Korea, were both fought against uniformed enemies. And they were fought in various climates. As you know, we fought in Normandy in the hedgerows, and we fought in the jungles of
We have a problem.
and it was very hot and humid most of the year. The problem with Vietnam fundamentally was that we were prohibited from going outside of South Vietnam, so that we only on 2 or 3 occasions were we allowed to chase or to follow up any of the enemy, whether they were Viet Cong, which were in the south, or North Vietnamese Army. In every battle that we fought, and in my case, for example, I commanded a regiment in Vietnam, a Marine regiment, and I was G3 of the 90,000 or so Marines we had there fighting the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. We never lost a battle with any of the so-called enemy, whether they were Viet Cong in the south or North Vietnamese Army who had come down from the north. But the problem was the Vietnamese, could come down they could come south outside of Vietnam and then infiltrate from the west. And it was really, I guess it's hard for me to say what it was, but I'll say it was a lousy war. There was, many of these fighters were not uniformed. They wore black semi-uniforms, and some of them used any kind of clothing, so you didn't know who they were. A little bit like some of the problems we face in Iraq today. But the quality was, the quality of fighting was jungle fighting, mainly with small arms, and very difficult to deal with because we would defeat a unit. I can remember defeating the 1st Viet Cong regiment twice in a period of less than a year. We tore them apart, beat them up, ruined them, chased them out of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and 3 months later, they're reinforced and back down again. So we had to fight them again. That was one of the really discouraging parts of that war. But whenever we met them, we beat the you-know-what out of them. But what we tried to do in the Marine sector was to set up what we called, I forgot the technical name we used, but we put a squad of Marines and 1 Navy corpsman in a village and left them. We called it a combined action program. And they did everything from deliver babies to show them how to dig wells and that sort of thing. and it worked. That system worked in the northern 5 provinces, which were the ones under our control, under Marine control. And when the Tet Offensive occurred in 1968, none of those villages succumbed to attacks by the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese Army. They held fast. But, you know, I don't want to say that that would have been easy to do for all of Vietnam. The Army folks didn't quite go with that kind of a program. But as long as the North Vietnamese could move in and out, move forces in and out, and move supplies of ammunition and food and weapons and so forth with freedom, when you couldn't go after them outside the borders of South Vietnam, when you have a situation like that with a determined enemy, and Ho Chi Minh was underestimated. He was the leader of the North, and he and General Giap were absolutely certain that they would win if they could keep up the kind of fight that they had with us, and if we stayed away from North Vietnam. We bombed them periodically. In fact, Senator McCain was shot down on a mission that was over North Vietnam. That's when he was captured. But we were prohibited literally from going after anybody. I'm not sure, I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure if we had gone north, would we be any better? I think we probably would be. I think we could have, we were superior in terms of fighting power and capabilities and all, if we had invaded North Vietnam, but we were prohibited from doing that, and being good soldiers, we didn't. Would we have won, quote, won, what do you do when you win a war? What do you do when you win that kind of war? There's no way you can tell whether it would have worked or not.
We just have time for one more question.
Okay.
And I thought I had a pretty good one. But, go ahead, Peter. Ask it, I'll tell you if it's good.
Just you hear different soldiers and stuff talk about their experiences in the war and how that has affected their worldview. For you as an individual, having the great responsibility, more than just being a soldier, you were a general, you had the responsibility of looking after countless soldiers, numerous. In view of that, how has that affected your worldview and how you live your life as an individual now, different than maybe how you were before you were?
The question is, when you face a bunch of enemy and you end up being instrumental in killing a lot of them. I have to be honest with you, I never shot an enemy myself. I did carry an M1 rifle because the Japanese had a tendency to pick off officers quickly, and I figured I'd look more like a private if I carried a rifle, so I carried an M1 during most of World War II. Whether that's the reason I'm here or not, I don't know, but I would say that on balance, I was proud of all the men I served with and all the officers I served with. And I have been saddened throughout my life since then over the specific deaths of some of them, because I knew them quite well. And it's like losing a son or a brother. How do you feel when you lose somebody like that? We had a practice when we had our last 2 or 3 reunions. One of our captains later became an Episcopal priest, and he had a practice of saying, okay, let's all be quiet for a few minutes and just repeat the names of 3 people quietly to yourself who were lost in Iwo. And we do that. We did it, I think, every time we had a reunion. But how do you feel? Well, how do you feel when you lose a brother? How do you feel when you lose an uncle or an aunt or a mother or or somebody who's close to you? Leaves a little hole in your soul somewhere that you try to fill by saying to yourself, okay, I think I did my best by him, and I'm always saddened that he's not able to be here sitting where you are talking about what happened in the war, but it's life, and I guess if you live long enough, you learn to accept the fact that it is life.